So, how important is canon to Star Wars and your experience of Star Wars in the grand scheme of things? And a question that I want to ask first and foremost is, if you don't particularly care about canon or changes to canon, does that make you any less of a fan? Because to some people, it does. And so, a lot of the discourse around The Acolyte and Star Wars recently has been the supposed changes that Disney are making that breaks canon. And, you could certainly look back and see that Disney, yes, they've definitely done some things that have changed canon. The biggest one being moving the EU into Legends so that they had a clean slate to work with. And I don't think anyone's under any false impressions that they did that because not only did they have their own story to tell, but it gave them the chance to capitalise on new books, games, the history. It is money motivated. I don't think anyone is under any impression otherwise that everything Disney does is profit motivated. That's kind of obvious. That's what the majority of the entertainment industry is there for. But when you look at these changes, firstly, how important are they to the story? And how much should they really affect your experiences and your enjoyment of it? Now, as I say, I want to just talk firstly about, whether you're more or less of a fan, if you do or don't care about that. I recently tweeted out that my belief is that the majority of Star Wars fans fall into a generalized category. And again, this is not going to apply for everyone, but it's just what I think the majority of people tend to believe. So firstly, that they're not, terminally online. They're not always talking about Star Wars. They're not looking at every piece of news. They are not reviewing every single bit of media that they consume. Certainly not on anything like Rotten Tomatoes. They just watch, they enjoy, and they get on with their life. The second, and this is where the backlash came in, is that they don't particularly care about canon. Now, that's not to say that they don't think canon is unimportant. It's something that I think we all understand, that there has to be a kind of base line for a story to be told. There has to be a consistency. But that's not necessarily what I'm talking about here. When I say don't care about canon, I mean that they don't particularly care if something is changed to suit the story. So that's where I think a lot of misunderstanding came in, but also where a lot of the kind of backlash came from. The third point is about George Lucas and how we appreciate everything that he's done. But we can definitely see that he's got some faults. He's not a god. Likewise with Disney, people know that Disney is not perfect. They've put out some really subpar stuff, and I am in agreement with that. But it's not going to stop us from watching and enjoying, because at the end of the day, we still just enjoy Star Wars. The fifth point, is that they don't particularly care about race, gender, sexuality, whether that's the casting or the characters, because they are just characters, they are just people, and it doesn't affect the story. I've yet to see how, in any way, shape or form, someone's race, gender, or sexuality has had an impact on the Star Wars stories that have been told. It's not. We've barely even gotten. We've had one gay kiss at the end of Rise of Skywalker that was scrubbed in a lot of countries. We've not really had anything beyond that. There's been, lesbian couples, but the most we've had is a brief intimate touch. But there's been nothing overtly about the story that's been impacted by that. And most people just don't care. They will just accept it because that's normal. It's normal to have a bit of diversity. And so the last point is that if they don't like something, they will stop watching. If they watch an episode of The Mandalorian and go, that's not really for me, they're probably not going to watch the next episode. If they watch an episode of The Acolyte and say, I don't think this is any good, they're probably not going to watch the next episode. They're certainly not going to go online and complain about the fact that they're now on the 4th episode and every episode has been terrible, and they know that episode 5 is going to be terrible, so they're just going to get through it. It's kind of... It doesn't make logical sense. Most people, if they do something they don't like, they're going to stop, unless they're forced to, or unless they have an ulterior motive to do it. So that's kind of what I said. In my opinion, the vast majority of Star Wars fans tend to fall into that category, and by all means, you might not. You might be on either side of that, Certainly it's not something that everyone's going to agree with, but that was just my perspective. And so from that came a lot of, I'd certainly say there was far more agreements than there was backlash, because, there was a lot of people saying, yeah, this is me. This is how I kind of identify. I'm just a casual, sort of fan. I just enjoy it. I don't really care about all this online discourse. And then there was, a smaller but more vocal kind of section that was saying, oh, this is ridiculous. If you don't care about Canon, you're not a fan. Canon is important, and there was all kinds of insults slung out there, which is, par for the course, really, which I found for the people who tend to hold those opinions. And so it got me to thinking, well, how is that the case? How is it if you don't care about lore, you can say to yourself that you're any less of a fan? Because at the end of the day, surely, and this is in my definition, if you like something, if you have consumed something in any form, whether it's novels, games, comics, TV shows, movies, if you've watched that and gone, I like that, you're a fan. You might not necessarily be as devoted a fan to someone who owns every piece of memorabilia, has memorized every bit of history, knows every single detail about every character. That's fine. It's okay to have different levels of fanaticism, which is where the term fan comes from, for a particular, piece of media. And so to say that someone is not a fan just because they don't care about lore or changes in lore, I think it's kind of like the base elements of gatekeeping. Gatekeeping seems to be a big thing at the moment for the online community, and that's why I say most people aren't terminally online, because most people don't gatekeep. The only time that I will say that you are not a true Star Wars fan is if you are truly and proudly and openly racist, sexist, homophobic, transphobic, those typical things, because you're not actively engaging in what makes Star Wars great, which is the idea of many, many different people of all different cultures coming together and enjoying this same thing. And George Lucas himself, who is a liberal, who is a big supporter of equal rights, you're kind of missing the point of what he wants to create. And you are just making a negative experience, and you're actively harming people. That's the only time that I would say that you're not a true Star Wars fan, is if your intent is to go out and actively harm people over something that they enjoy, because of your kind of views. That's the only time that I would step in and say, this is okay to actually gatekeep. But I would never try and gatekeep for something that, was an opinion on stories, characters, whatever it might be. Now, moving on to the second point, and the first question I asked, how important is canon actually to the story and to your experiences? And I view canon in two ways. One of them is the consistency of the universe, so the kind of logic that's behind everything. And I think a good example of this is the Force. The Force is a very important aspect of Star Wars. It's not, implemented in every story, and every character doesn't get involved with it, but it's a big thread through that universe, and there does need to be a consistency with it. That's not to say that you can't expand on it, add to it, but it has to kind of match up with what has happened in the past, because it is a very important element. Now, how people might view that logic is going to be different, but for me, it's not a rigid thing. I'm very accepting and open of expanding the Force, and the idea that more people might have, used the Force or called it something different, or there's different abilities that are discovered, that's fine. That's fine in my opinion. The second element of lore and canon is the history, the stories, the people, and, how they are applied to, the current story. Now, again, going back to the Disney changes that were made when they first took over the IP, moving EU into Legends, that took away a whole host of, stories and, established, kind of characters, and it put them on the sideline to be retold. And in some instances, those stories and characters have come back in a different form. Some instances, we've never seen it again. Now, again, this is where I ask, how important is that? And to me, and again, this is all just my opinion, to me, it's not vastly important, because when you look at it from a logical perspective, those stories still happened. Those stories were still told. You still experienced those stories. You enjoyed them. And if you choose to, you can still go back and watch and read and enjoy them. There's nothing stopping you from doing that. And headcanon is, for me, far more important than actual canon. Because your headcanon should be really the only thing that matters. Because headcanon applies to everything. No matter what you are watching, reading, or experiencing, you always have an element of your own headcanon at play. Even if a scene that you are watching or reading about is described in crystal clear detail, you are still applying your own headcanon to that. And that's fine. That's the way it should be, because we all experience and imagine and interpret things in our own way. And so long as you can do that, and you can separate, your own headcanon from actual canon, there should be no reason for you to ever really get angry over a change in canon. Because you can sit there and just say, well, the thing that I enjoyed and that I still consider canon is still there. That's fine. If someone was to come along and say to you, hey, that made-up story in that made-up universe, that no longer exists, does that sound like a logical sentence? Doesn't really, does it? Because again, it is all make-believe. It's not like we're trying to go back in history and say, well, actually, you know what? We found out that it wasn't the Egyptians that built the pyramids. It was actually the Greeks. That's not what we're trying to do. We're not trying to change facts. We're changing made-up stories. And that's the important element. They are made up. And so it can be whatever you want it to be. So whilst it is important, yes, to have a consistency to the logic, it's not really that important that stories stay the same. Because you can interpret the stories in your own way. And so, that's always, and it doesn't matter what franchise it is, that always happens. Star Trek, Harry Potter, any of these kind of ongoing IPs that, people want to expand, there's always going to have to be something that changes. And so I think you have to be able to try and separate yourself and accept that changes are always going to happen, that your experiences with the old are never going to change. Your kind of sentimentality and enjoyment is always going to be there. And you can always go back and watch or read or play those old things over and over again to your heart's content. No one's stopping you from doing that. So I think that personal offence needs to not necessarily be taken from changes in canon. But like I say, there also does have to be a level of consistency. So as long as that consistency is there, which I think it has, and again, this is all down to opinions at the end of the day. But what isn't acceptable is to say to people, well, if you don't care about changes in canon, you're not a fan. Because that's just blatantly not true, and that's you applying your own distorted sense of gatekeeping to the entire community, So that's kind of what my thoughts are on it. I certainly think that canon has its place. Consistency is important, but it's not the be-all and end-all. If it gets changed, it gets changed. You can still enjoy things that are no longer canon. And, you shouldn't allow such a simple thing as ki-adi-mundi showing up in a show. The legends said he shouldn't have been born yet. Ruin your day or ruin your experience of Star Wars. At the end of the day, you should be aware enough to go and look at that scene and say, okay, there's ki-adi-mundi. They didn't mention a Sith, so there's no logical reason right now as to why in 100 years, when they're talking about the Sith, that he should pipe up and say, yes, they were there 100 years ago, and that line that I said about 1,000 years doesn't make sense. You have to remember, this is the ki-adi-mundi that when he was presented with tangible evidence by one of the most trusted Jedi, he still denied. So if anything, that is in character, that's in keeping with canon, that he would deny that the Sith could possibly be back. That's even if he knew, which at this point he doesn't because it was not mentioned. And, for all we know, all those Jedi on that planet, facing down with Darth Teeth, as some people have coined it, they could die. And honestly, I like that idea. I like the stakes. I like the risk. I like the fact that, a Sith should be powerful if he is a Sith. And so if those characters all die and Wed doesn't get back, no reason that ki-adi-mundi should ever know that Sith was a thing. Likewise, even if he does, there's plausible deniability and there is consistency in the storytelling that he would still in his own head deny that was the case. So again, it's just thinking about it with a little bit of perspective, not jumping the gun, because by all we know, this is just the 4th episode. By the end of the show, there's another 4 episodes. There might be a reasonable explanation. Whether that's everyone dying or whether there is a cover-up, we don't know. Don't jump the gun. That's why it should be a case of wait, watch, then analyze. You know, that's the way it should be. And at the end of the day, they're made up stories. Don't get so agitated that you go and start attacking people online, because that's the terminally online part that I was talking about, that most people are not. And if anything, you know, you're kind of just showing that you fall outside of that category. So yeah, enjoy. Feel free to criticize. Feel free to, you know, have your own opinions, but try and, you know, apply a little bit of logic and kindness to your opinions. So yeah, I'd love to know what you think in the comments. So thank you for watching, and I'll see you around, certainly for my next reaction to The Acolyte.